Welcome to the second lecture for Period 4 of AP World History at Parkway North. I'm Scott Nilsson, and today we'll be tackling the question faced by societies across the world from 1450 to 1750 CE. Namely, now that the world is all interconnected for trade and stuff, how do you organize things such that you can guarantee that you're making goods to sell? In other words, how can you organize your society's labor to make sure that you can take advantages of the opportunities of the suddenly interconnected world? In this case, it's useful to draw a distinction between the Old World, comprised of Africa and Eurasia, and the New World, comprised of the Americas. Each of these areas had distinct and different problems, which led to distinct and different methods for organizing their labor. For folks living in the Old World, the answer is more or less the same as it was during the previous time period. You make your peasants do it. There are, of course, a variety of types of peasantry, from the near slavery of Russian serfs to the relative independence of the Chinese or Ottoman free peasants. For the elites of the Old World, the system certainly wasn't broken, so there was no need to change it. That didn't mean, though, that things didn't evolve in some areas. For example, silk had been produced in China for at least 1,000 years at this point. 4 factors worked together to increase silk production by peasants during this time period in China. First, Spain became really wealthy during this time period and sought out luxury goods. Second, Spain's wealth came largely in the form of silver mined in the New World. Third, the Chinese government wanted its taxes paid exclusively in silver. Fourth, the Chinese silk industry was decentralized and peasant-based. All of this meant that Chinese peasants responded to the increased Spanish demand for silk by increasing silk production, particularly since they got paid in the very metal which they needed to pay their taxes. Win-win for everyone. A similar phenomenon happened in India, responding to European fashion demands. For centuries, the main cloth of choice in Europe was wool, mainly because the sheep were available for it, and anything else was really expensive. Again, for over 1,000 years, India had been specializing in creating a different textile. Wool doesn't work so well in the tropical heat of India, so Indians had perfected the art of making cotton textiles, which were lighter and more suited for their environment. When the Portuguese reached India, they started trading in this light, cheap fabric. They called it calico, since it was from Calicut. The trade in cotton cloth became so popular that it began to supplant wool in many places around Europe. Cotton production in India was, again, decentralized and peasant-based, but cotton textile production ramped up in India during this time period due to the opportunities afforded by long-distance trade. The intensification of peasant labor in the silk and cotton industries was a response to market conditions. The government didn't have to get involved. A different situation played out in Russia, though, where the Tsars sought to push eastward into Siberia, largely due to the fur trade. However, in combination with that trade, the government thought it would be a good idea to begin settling the Siberian frontier, both as a way to make the trade easier and as a way to bolster their eastern territorial claims. However, convincing someone to pick up and resettle in the harsh Siberian climate isn't exactly an easy sell. So the Tsars incentivized it by offering to liberate any serf who would settle on the frontier. For many, the choice to brave the elements was one they couldn't pass up. After all, you can't spell freezing without free, right? The New World, on the other hand, was, well, new, with new problems which required new solutions. Different solutions worked for different areas. In Andean South America, for example, the problem the Spanish faced was how to extract as much shiny metal from the ground as they could, as quickly as they could. This required mining to occur, and mining is more or less a terrible job that will reduce your life expectancy a lot, even in the best of conditions. So the locals weren't really fired up about doing it, particularly when it wasn't benefiting them in any way. The Spanish, therefore, had to force the locals to work. Fortunately for them, the Spanish, not the locals, the Incans left behind a simple solution at hand: the mita system. Local workers were required to pay their taxes to the Spanish in the form of labor, which meant that they got to work in the mine for a portion of the year. And if you were sufficiently clever and motivated, and the Spanish were, you could organize the system such that the mines were running the whole year, even if your labor supply was constantly changing over that time period. So the Spanish dug their silver out of the Andes on the back of a forced labor tax. In the rest of the New World, the problem wasn't extracting minerals from the ground, but rather growing and harvesting crops to be processed and sold back in Europe. Think things like sugar, tobacco, cotton, indigo, rice, that sort of thing. This is a problem the Spanish thought they knew how to solve. After all, growing crops is what they did back home in Spain, right? And they had a system worked out for that. They called it feudalism. So the Spanish's first attempt at organizing this labor was imposing something like feudalism in the Americas. It was called the encomienda system, and it worked like this. A conquistador was given a plot of land in the New World with some natives on it. The conquistador's job was to protect the natives from outside raiders and convert them into good Catholics. In exchange, the presumably grateful natives would gladly offer up tribute in the form of labor, or goods, or gold. You may not be surprised to find out that the system had lots of problems with it. First, there weren't any outside invaders for the natives to be protected against. Well, except the Spanish, but that wasn't particularly persuasive to the conquistadors. Second, the natives didn't particularly want to be converted to Catholicism. Third, they weren't all that grateful about the situation, and so didn't offer up really anything in the way of tribute. That made the Spanish mad, so they started brutally mistreating the natives. Fourth, that caused native uprisings, which were disturbingly successful. So the Spanish government scrapped the encomienda system and replaced it with a different one. The new one was called the hacienda system, and it worked like this. The conquistador was given a plot of land, but not the people on it. Those natives were free to do as they wanted. However, if the thing they wanted to do was eat, then they needed to grow crops, and for that they had to pay the landlord, the conquistador, rent for the use of his fields. If available, the conquistador would happily take payment in the form of gold, but usually the rent was paid in goods instead. This is essentially sharecropping. The landlord owns all the fields and allows the peasants to pay rent with a share of their crops. The landlord may use some of those crops for food and whatnot, but will likely sell all the rest for a hefty profit. As an editorial aside, I don't care how good the food is, you wouldn't go eat at a restaurant called Sharecroppers. There's too much history of exploitation and racial animus and general ickiness to be comfortable eating at such a place. So if you wouldn't eat at a place called Sharecroppers, why would you eat at a place called Hacienda? In modern-day Mexico and Central America, the hacienda system largely worked, in the sense that the elites got really rich and there weren't too many uprisings. The Caribbean posed different problems. The crops, in particular sugar, were much more labor-intensive to grow, and rates of sickness and disease were much higher than elsewhere in the New World. There was the additional problem that pretty much all of the native population died off, either from disease or from the brutal work conditions. So there were farms that needed workers, and the local supply was gone. Clearly then, workers needed to be imported, but how? The first option was to pay people to come work in a system called indentured servitude. The trade was this, and the plantation owner would pay for your transit across the Atlantic, while you would agree to work for the plantation owner for a certain number of years. The exact number of years varied, but 7 is kind of a decent sort of average number to keep in mind. After that term of years was up, you would be free to do your own thing. This, however, was a colossal bust in the Caribbean, because no workers lived long enough to get their freedom. As such, even though the plantation owners were willing, there was no supply of potential workers that was volunteering to take on the risk of working on the plantation. Indentured servitude did work out quite well in the northern British colonies, though, where field work was nowhere near as brutal and life expectancy was really quite good. The answer to the problem they faced on the plantations, then, was to use workers for whom voluntary willingness wasn't a concern. Slaves. Chattel slavery. Remember, chattel sounds like cattle, so these are slaves that could be bought and sold like cattle. Chattel slavery in the Caribbean was different than the slavery which had already existed for years around the Mediterranean and in the Middle East. Those slaves, many of whom also came from Africa, were used for household work rather than field work. The slaves tended to work as maids or in kitchens or as objects of sexual gratification. This is not to imply that their situation was any better or worse or any more or less dehumanizing. It's just to say that their situation was different and that their life expectancy was longer. Caribbean slaves were different. They worked in the fields, growing the crops, and they worked there more or less non-stop until they died. The plantation owners used African slaves for a number of reasons. They tended to be more resistant to the diseases circulating on the plantations. They also tended to be more familiar with the crops being grown, which meant that they were better workers. And, unlike indentured servants, who were white Europeans, Caribbean slaves were black Africans, thus easily distinguished from their white overseers and more easily thought of as different and subhuman. Racism, as we know it today, starts taking its shape from this time period. As an economic proposition, slavery worked for a number of centuries. The Atlantic system worked like this economically. Europeans bought slaves in Africa and transported them to the Caribbean, mostly, but also Brazil and the American South. The slaves worked to their deaths on plantations, growing things like sugar and cotton and tobacco. That sugar and cotton and tobacco was then transported to Europe, where it was either sold directly or refined and sold. The Europeans took some of the money from these sales and pocketed it as profit. The rest they used to buy more slaves to take to the Caribbean to begin the process anew. The success of this system created demand in Africa for more slaves, which ended up having demographic effects on sub-Saharan Africa. And the introduction of Africans in the New World created a new set of demographic and societal shifts, many of which continue to shape life in the Western Hemisphere today. For a more complete discussion of slavery, please go watch Crash Course World History number 24 on the Atlantic slave trade. We, on the other hand, will discuss the demographic and social ramifications of the African slave trade, and indeed all of these systems will labor much more thoroughly in class. Thank you, and I'll talk to you then.